All right, let's dive right into this explainer. When we think about historical conflicts, our minds almost automatically go straight to massive armies, right? We picture thousands of soldiers lining up, charging head-on in this brutal test of sheer numbers. But what we're looking at today completely flips that traditional narrative on its head. We're going to explore a radically different approach to warfare in Indian history, one where the size of your army actually mattered way less than the sharpness of your strategy.
Which brings us to a really compelling question. How exactly do you defeat an unbeatable army? I mean, think about it. If you're vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and facing down an empire with what seems like unlimited resources, how do you even stand a chance? Well, as the historical data shows us, the answer absolutely does not lie in trying to raise a bigger army. No, it lies in speed, in total surprise, and in brilliantly smart tactics. It's all about rewriting the rules of engagement so that the enemy's massive size literally becomes their biggest weakness.
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll cover the fundamental art of guerrilla warfare. Then, we'll look at Shivaji, the absolute master of these tactics, followed by Maharana Pratap's legendary forest resistance. After that, we'll dive into the specific tactics of the 1857 rebellion, and finally wrap up with tribal warfare and the lasting legacy of these methods. We've got over 300 years of history to cover, so let's get right to it.
Section 1. The Art of Guerrilla Warfare, Strategy over Strength. The fundamental contrast here is just night and day. On one side, traditional warfare is all about direct confrontation. Massive armies meeting on predictable, wide-open battlefields. But guerrilla warfare, it throws that entire playbook right out the window. It relies on sudden ambushes, devastating hit-and-run attacks, and above all, a ridiculously deep, intimate knowledge of the local terrain. The environment itself becomes an active weapon against an invader who just doesn't understand the landscape.
In Indian history, this whole concept was crystallized into a very specific strategic doctrine known as Ganimi Kava. Essentially, that translates to the art of unconventional warfare. It is the ultimate method for turning an enemy's overwhelming size and rigid structure completely against them. It's like, well, if you can't beat a giant in an arm wrestling match, you just refuse to sit at the table. You strike from the shadows instead.
So how does this actually work in practice? Let's break down the step-by-step methodology. Step 1. Attack suddenly. Complete surprise is absolutely non-negotiable. Step 2. Disappear quickly, way before the enemy can even think about organizing a counterattack. Step 3. Don't just go after the soldiers. You've got to target their weak points, like their food and supply lines, basically starving the massive machine. And Step 4. Use the local geography, dense forests, steep hills, to your absolute advantage. This 4-step loop right here, it makes even a tiny force incredibly lethal.
Section 2. Shivaji, master of Ganimi Kava and the founder of the Maratha Empire.
Now, the crucial thing to understand here is that Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj didn't just get lucky once. He repeatedly and systematically used timing, terrain, and psychological strategy to completely outmaneuver his foes. To see exactly how he pulled this off, we're going to look closely at two absolutely thrilling examples from the sources: the Battle of Pratapgarh in 1659 and a famously daring night attack in Pune in 1663.
All right, let's set the scene for 1659, the trap at Pratapgarh Fort. The Marathas were facing Afzal Khan, who was this highly formidable general from the Bijapur Sultanate. Khan rolled up with a vast, heavily armed force, and his one goal was to crush Shivaji. But Khan tried to play dirty. He proposed a peaceful one-on-one meeting to negotiate while secretly planning to assassinate Shivaji right then and there.
But, Shivaji was always several steps ahead. He fully anticipated the betrayal. When Afzal Khan went in for the surprise attack during their embrace, Shivaji was actually wearing hidden armor under his clothes. He defended himself, struck back, and killed the general. And instantly, the hidden Maratha army launched a sudden, highly coordinated strike on Khan's leaderless forces right out of the surrounding dense forests. The result? A massive victory that firmly cemented Maratha power. It's just a perfect, textbook example of flawless planning combined with absolute surprise.
Fast forward 4 years to 1663, and the stakes were even higher. The night raid in Pune. A Mughal general named Shaista Khan, who actually happened to be the uncle of Emperor Aurangzeb, had occupied the city of Pune. And he didn't just bring a small crew, he brought an overwhelming Mughal force and actually set up camp right inside Shivaji's own childhood palace. I mean, on paper, the situation looked completely impossible for the much smaller Maratha forces.
But once again, Ganami Kava comes into play.
Instead of some suicidal frontal assault on the city, Shivaji and a very small, hand-picked group of warriors secretly infiltrated Pune under the cover of darkness. They launched this incredibly fast-paced, cinematic night attack directly inside the Mughal camp, literally right into Shaista Khan's personal quarters. In the absolute chaos, Shaista Khan was severely injured and actually forced to flee out of a window. The psychological impact of this was just immense. It massively damaged Mughal prestige, and Shaista Khan was utterly humiliated and reassigned out of the Deccan. So a tiny, fast team completely broke the spirit of a massive occupying force.
Moving on to Section 3, Maharana Pratap's Forest Resistance, the Aravalli Campaign.
To really get Maharana Pratap's strategy, we have to look at the timeline, specifically zooming in on the year 1576. This year marks a major turning point in his military approach against the Mughal Empire, where he shifts from a traditional style of warfare to a deeply unconventional, guerrilla-based campaign. Notice the brilliant strategic pivot here. At the Battle of Haldighati in 1576, it was a direct battle. Maharana Pratap and his forces showed immense, historic bravery, but they simply had fewer resources, and the Mughals ultimately claimed victory. But look at what happens post-Haldighati. Pratap doesn't just give up and surrender. Instead, he shifts his entire approach to guerrilla warfare. Using the deep, natural cover of the Aravalli Hills, he orchestrated these relentless hit-and-run forest attacks on Mughal posts. And through this exhausting war of attrition, he successfully regained a massive amount of his lost territory. A real game-changer.
Section 4. Tactics of the 1857 Rebellion. Fighting the British East India Company.
Jumping forward to the 1800s, our sources highlight a really key figure, Tatya Tope. He was one of the most prominent military leaders of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and what makes his campaigns between 1857 and 1859 so fascinating is how drastically his strategy had to evolve. After suffering the loss of major, fortified cities to the British, he had to adapt quickly or face total defeat.
And adapt he certainly did. He shifted his entire surviving force completely over to guerrilla warfare. He stopped trying to hold on to cities and instead conducted rapid, lightning-fast attacks. He strictly avoided any large-scale pitched battles where British artillery would easily have the upper hand. By moving constantly, and I mean constantly, across the vast, difficult terrain of central India, he essentially forced the immense British military machine to chase shadows. This relentless movement deeply frustrated and exhausted British forces for months. And even though he was eventually captured, his brilliant use of evasion totally inspired future resistance movements.
Section 5. Tribal Warfare and Lasting Legacy. The Forest Frontiers.
An incredibly powerful example of this frontier resistance is the Birsa Munda movement to the 1890s. Birsa Munda led various tribal groups who were facing severe exploitation and displacement by British colonial authorities. Now, they definitely didn't have modern weapons, but they had something the British absolutely did not: a total, absolute mastery of their environment.
Their strategy relied on deep integration with the local forests. They used the dense canopy to launch highly coordinated, surprise guerrilla attacks against British outposts. And while the overwhelming military might of the British did ultimately suppress the uprising, the Birsa Munda movement proved, once again, just how effectively terrain could be weaponized. It left behind this enduring, powerful symbol of tribal resistance and courage that's actually still celebrated today.
Which brings us to our final section, Advantages and Impact. How the underdog wins. So why does all this matter? What's the big takeaway here? Well, these tactics allowed noticeably smaller forces to consistently fight and deal heavy damage to infinitely stronger enemies. By refusing traditional combat, they maximized their survival with far fewer resources. This strategy literally kept resistance movements alive for years, sometimes decades, when they otherwise would have been crushed in a single afternoon. Ultimately, guerrilla warfare in Indian history wasn't just some military technique. It became a lasting symbol of intelligence, raw courage, and unbreakable determination. Which leaves us with this final, incredibly powerful thought from our sources. When power is unequal, the smartest strategy becomes the strongest weapon. It's such a brilliant reminder that brute strength and massive resources aren't the only ways to achieve victory. Sometimes, the sharpest minds, using speed, surprise, and the very ground beneath their feet, can topple absolute giants. Which really leaves us to wonder, what modern giants could be toppled today if we just change the rules of the game? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you in the next one.